Hey everyone, welcome back to the React Native TDD stream. I'm Josh Justice, aka Coding It Wrong. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad to be here. Sorry for the hiccup last week. I was not able to stream because I was remote working from the in-laws' house, and I neglected to realize just how many pixels are on a MacBook Pro, and the stream resolution looked like a postage stamp on there, and I couldn't get it adjusted right. So we're back now, back on my big but incredibly low resolution Game Boy monitor, so we're good to go. I'll be sure to check that out in advance next time I need to stream from remotely. So we have a really interesting problem to solve today, and so I hope it'll be enjoyable for you to look into. As a reminder, if this is your first time joining in on the stream or the recording, we are building out an app. It's called Opinion 8, and it's for tracking restaurants and dishes that we like and what we think of them. And so we have a test suite here. We've been using test-driven development to build it out. And when we ended last time, so I guess I should make a quick note first. If you look in the stream notes, you'll see the GitHub repo for the project, and you'll be able to pull it down there if you want to. So when we finished last time, we got the create dish functionality working. So we were able to create a restaurant and create a dish within the restaurant. I'm going to run the end-to-end test real quick here so you can see it. You can just kind of watch it over on the side here. As a reminder, we're using detox for end-to-end tests and enzyme with jest for component tests. So you see we've added a dish volcano roll, and now we've gotten a failure. So I've added, since last time, I've added in the new test we're going to use here to drive our new behavior. Not only do we want to create dishes within a restaurant, and so they get created, and so that's fine. But when we go back to the restaurant screen and then go back to the dishes screen, we want the dish to persist. So why doesn't it? Well, right now we have the restaurant screen here. This is called restaurant list, and we see that in component state we store the list of restaurants. So that's fine. And then in dish list, though, as we go into an individual dish, we see that we're storing, I think, we are pulling the list of dish names off of the restaurant that's passed in here. But then when we add a new dish, it's just being added into that array that lives here on the state of this component. So it's no longer there. It's lost. It's been copied over. I think that's how that works. It's being lost in between screens. And so what we need to do is to store the dish names in a more permanent way. I want to try first just with what React and React Native provide built in with component state. And then that's actually not going to work for an interesting reason that threw me off at first. So it'll be fun to explore together. And then we're going to see an alternative. And you might have seen in my menu bar there the alternative we're going to go for. So we'll talk about that soon. Cool. So just to look at the test here, what we're doing, we're clicking on the restaurants label here up at the top. And you can see I've used a bit more of an advanced detox feature. Another time we could get more into the details here. But I find an element that has the trait button, and then it has a descendant with the label of restaurant. And so this is something where kind of the internals of UIKit are being exposed to us. We didn't create restaurants in the top navigation bar here. React, actually, it's not native code, it's React Navigation. It creates it for us. And so I had to do a little experimenting, maybe Googling, to find out what I can use to trigger this menu bar option here. But just know that you can compose detox matchers here like this to be able to navigate around if just pulling something up by label doesn't work. We go back to the restaurants list. We find the label by restaurant name and tap it, and then we go back to the dish name variable. For the dish name we entered before, we look for it to confirm that it's still visible. And in our case, it's not, because that data is being lost. So once we get this fixed, this end-to-end test should pass. And so we'll see what we can do here. So again, remember, currently what's happening is when we, let's see here, when we choose a restaurant, we use React Navigation to navigate to the dish list, and we pass the restaurant object into it. So in the dish list here, when we're constructing it, we retrieve the navigation, we retrieve the restaurant, and we extract the dish names from it. So if we have dish names on here, they will be copied into this new screen. But then when we modify them, we just set them on the state locally here. And so instead, what I'm thinking of doing, we did a refactoring previously, so when we create restaurants on the restaurant list, those are objects that not only have a name, but they also have a dish names array on it. And so what I kind of want to do is to have the restaurant array here in the restaurant list state to be the authoritative place where state lives. And so, you know, using React component state, we want to lift state up to the the uppermost component that needs access to it. So I want this to be our authoritative place. And so what we can do is, what I want to be able to do is do what I typically do in React, which is when I go to this dish list screen, I want to pass down an action that I call. To call back up to restaurant list, it's data down, actions up. So I want to call back up with an action that adds a dish onto the parent element here, that adds a dish into the restaurant here, and then that new dish data should flow down to the child screen to see it. So let's give that a try. I am going to use my cheater monitor here because this is some more, the core I'm focusing on is not this change because it's actually not going to work for us. So I'm going to go check and see the changes that I made here. So really what we want to do is when we go to the dish list, when we navigate to it, we want to pass an action. We want to say on add dish. And so what we're going to do, this is going to be an action we call. We're going to pass back the new dish name. The dish list is going to be able to pass back the new dish name. And from there, we're going to go to this handle add dish. We're going to add a handle add dish method. We'll pass the restaurant and the new dish name. So this is going to be our new function that's going to handle the adding of the dish. So let's add it right here. I'm going to take the restaurant, new dish name. Scroll down over here. Okay, so we want to update the restaurant, and there's going to be a little bit of ES6+ magic here to update it. Const restaurants. So we want to extract the restaurants from the state here. We want to create some updated restaurants. And we're going to do something there, and then we're going to do this set state restaurants. So yeah, so we're going to take the restaurants, update it, and then set that new state on here. So what is that going to be? Well, I'm just going to copy and paste this over, honestly, because it's a lot, and I could walk through it one bit at a time, but we're going to stay away from it. Really what we're doing here, and yeah, we don't need that console log either. So we're going to map through the list of restaurants here. So we're going to do a modified version. So if it's the restaurant that we've designated here, then we're going to update it. And it's going to be the same restaurant name and any other attributes, but for the dish names, we're going to add the new dish name onto it and return that updated restaurant. But for any other restaurants, we're going to just return them as is. So yeah, the change should be after we run all this, that the list of restaurants should contain all other restaurants unchanged, but the restaurant we've designated here should have the new dish name added to it. I see a question here in the chat. Rem10 says, your advice to learn React.js before starting with React Native or just hop in with some good React Native courses? I could go either way on that. I think if you, you know, what I would say off the top of my head is if you are a web developer, it could be good to do at least a little bit of React.js. And then that way, the browser and the DOM you're working in is going to be familiar and you'll learn React paradigms there. But if you haven't done front-end web development before, or if you have done native development before, I might go ahead with React Native. There's some great resources. In fact, I'll make myself a reminder to share some resources for tutorials because I know some good ones that have really helped me out as well. So thank you for your question. All right, so we're handling add dish here, so that should handle that. And that might be, I think that's all the changes we need in restaurant list. So that's nice. So let's go back over to dish list and make some changes there. So in here, again, just checking my cheater monitor here. Okay, so previously we were extracting the dish names and setting them on the state in the constructor, but we don't need to do that anymore because we're not storing the state locally. Okay, now when we're adding a dish, so this is when within the dish list screen we want to handle adding the dish. So we no longer are updating the dish names here, we're just setting the state to be is modal add visible false. So what do we do with the new dish name? Well, here's the core of what we do. We want to get that onAddDish function that was passed into here, this function. So we're going to go to this.props.navigation.getParam onAddDish. All right. Now we're going to call that onAddDish with new dish name. And remember, at the point that we're calling it, we just pass in one new dish name, but then the restaurant here that's passed over to handle add dish, that's captured in the closure here. So yeah, so that's all that happens in here. So new dish list isn't storing the state. It's storing its own local state of if the add modal is visible, because that's user interface state. That doesn't need to be stored in any centralized place. But our business logic state, our core application state here, is just passed in, and then we pass it back up, and then modifying it by calling this function in the parent. I think there's some changes to the render method as well. So we no longer need to pull the dish names out of the state. Instead, we're going to pull them out this way. Going to go to navigation, created by React Navigation, get param restaurant. So we're getting the restaurant and we're extracting the dish names from it, which we were doing up earlier, but right now it's just something that we're going to put in the render method. And then our hope is that this will be updated when we change the restaurant list state, and then those changes will just flow down here and re-render our component. Is that all the changes? Looks like it. All right, let me see on the chat. Remaitin says, thanks, I bought some courses on Udemy when there's a good sale last week. Refreshing my JavaScript knowledge and want to start with React now. Yeah, it's really enjoyable, and React Native in particular provides some really good stuff. I'm actually about to get focused more on React on the web as well, just kind of for my personal research. So once we end this React Native series, we might get into some React web stuff. We'll see. All right, so this may be all the changes. I wouldn't be surprised if I've gotten it wrong in the first try here, but let's just rerun our detox test and see if this all passes. So we're adding a restaurant here. Save it. Click on here. We're in our child screen. We add a dish. Save it. So nothing shows up on the screen here right away. So this is what I was expecting from my working ahead and having tripped on this before. But let's try something that might not be totally intuitive. So nothing has shown up on the Sushi Place restaurants list here. But if we go back to restaurants and go back in, now it's showing up. Juddy, it's good to see you back. Sorry, I hope I didn't throw off your morning last week when I missed the ability to live stream, but I'm glad you're back. So yeah, so check it out here. When we add, and I'll do it again. We have one dish on Sushi Place. We'll add good old California roll. Now it does not show up right away, but if we go back to restaurants and go back into it, now it shows up. So why is that? So remember what's happening in the dish list here. We're rendering it. We're pulling out the list, the restaurant from the navigation props passed to this component, and we pull out the dish names and render it. Then we call back up to restaurant list, on add dish, we're handling adding the dish, we're updating the state here with our crazy complicated immutable object change here. And we expected this to flow down because that's the way that React works, right? We have parent components, data flows down to child components, they re-render when necessary. So that's not working here. The reason why is this. When we call navigation.navigate, that's not regular React prop passing. That's a separate API, a React Navigation API. And so this is not rerun when the value of restaurant changes. It's not automatically updated. Now, if we just had these all on one screen and we were manually doing navigation ourselves, then it could very well be that the props flow down in a normal way. But because we're using React Navigation here and calling navigation.navigate instead of embedding a child component in a render method, that data doesn't automatically flow down. So there could be other ways to handle this and to get this data to flow. But this, maybe by refactoring where the data was stored and stuff like this. But when I ran into this, doing this as a hobby project, this is the point where I was like, I know I'm going to need some kind of centralized state store anyways. And having to do this kind of complicated immutable mapping was already kind of painful to me. Some folks may love it and be fine with it or use other immutable tools. But when I ran into this, I was already ready to refactor towards a state store. And so that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to pause for a question here. Jody says, no problem. He watched Kyle Shevlin's talk from ByteConf instead. Yeah, I have some folks that I know as Twitter friends that spoke at ByteConf, so I'll have to check that out. So Jody or others, let me know if there were other great talks or if Kyle's was good from that conference, because I'm always looking for stuff to listen to while I'm in the car. Sweet. Okay, so what are we going to do? So we see that React, because we're using React Navigation, this is not React Navigation's fault. They just have an API that's not simply React prop passing. And so we're not able to pass props down and store it on component state here, at least the way that I'm approaching it so far. So what can we do? Well, this is certainly a place where you could reach for one of a number of different state storage systems. You could reach for Redux as the classic. You could reach for the new React Context API. I haven't gotten a chance to play with that yet, but some friends of mine and I from work are going to be talking through that in different state storage next week. But for me, I'm actually a particularly big fan of MobX. I heard from Chain React Conference, some folks posted on there that they felt like MobX was pretty popular around there. And it is in React in general, but I think Redux has much more adoption in the React web world in general. So I'm wondering if MobX may be more popular in React Native. I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear anyone's thoughts if you have on that. But MobX is nice. It fits with some of my background for the way to think about things. Objects. Using mutability, I'm all about mutability, I'm fine with that. And some automatic updating of stuff. Like, I think it's really nice. So what we're going to do here is we're going to refactor to use MobX. You could actually, if you're interested, you could try starting from the same commit up in the public repo and try introducing Redux instead if you like, and kind of to see how that works out. But we're going to try with MobX here. And so now we run into something else that interesting happened. So I don't work in React day to day, and so I like MobX, but I'm not in it all the time. So as I thought about introducing MobX to the project, I was feeling a lot of uncertainty. I actually would not have been prepared for the stream last week if we got on together. I'm just not familiar with how things work in MobX. And some things can sometimes silently fail if you don't do things right. And so I was interested in, I was like, yeah, let me do this exercise in advance. Mostly I've been just live coding as we go, but I was like, let me code this out in advance. And what I found myself doing is, even though I wanted to unit test, to test drive these stores, these MobX store classes, I found myself not wanting to do so, but instead just creating them from scratch and letting the end-to-end test drive it. And so I was feeling kind of bad about that until I realized, wait a second, like this is a real process. In some sense, you could consider it spiking, where you kind of code something before you do really formal test-driven development. And so here's why. The classes that you create with MobX are very simple ES6 classes with just a few decorators added. And so I don't feel any uncertainty about the setup of those classes. You'll see soon that the setup of them is super trivial. The uncertainty I feel is about getting all the MobX wiring hooked up right. So really, the best value that I can get is to first let the end-to-end test drive and confirm that my MobX wiring is working correctly, and getting that all confirmed. And then after that, either on the stream or maybe next week, depending on how much time we have, I'll do the unit test afterwards. So it's kind of like a spike to build out the functionality and make sure that the pieces are wired up first. And then I'm actually going to go back. I wouldn't always do this in a real project, but in this case, I'm going to go back and undo those components, those classes, and redo them. So this is, I mean, you may be, if you haven't used MobX, you may be in the same shoes as me. Like, we're going to be experimenting together and figuring out how MobX works, how we can get these things working together. So we're going to do the end-to-end test first. So this will be fun to kind of try this out. I'm going to move MobX over to the cheater monitor here so I can think through it. So let's see what I can remember to describe to you about MobX. So I'm going to create a store folder here just to use for any kind of storage related stuff. And I've done Rails on the back end, and I've done a good amount of server-side development. And some of the patterns I'm using here, MobX doesn't really dictate a lot of the patterns for how you store stuff. So some of these patterns are going to be influenced by what I've done on the server side. So I kind of want to have a restaurant store. Just having like one class like that seems good. We'll do, we'll call it export default. Let's go ahead and export it. Class restaurant store. Okay, so it's a class. So that's nice. So what do we want on here? We're going to start out just keeping this as a basic class. So we're going to create the restaurant store, the restaurants, and the dishes. So internally as a property, I forget if I have Babel 7 installed. Do I? Parsing. No, it looks like I probably have Babel 6. Okay, well that's fine. Okay, so we'll just use a regular property. So we're just going to store an array of restaurants on the restaurant store. And that may lead you to wonder, like, well, why would we bother doing that if the restaurant store is effectively just a list of restaurants? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to create a method that encapsulates this knowledge of how to create a restaurant here, the fact that a restaurant has these fields. And in fact, we're no longer going to do that anymore. We're going to create an object. So we're going to have a method here called add restaurant. Nope, that's not the import we want. Add restaurant, new restaurant name. We just call it name here. And we're going to say new restaurant equals name. And then, so we're recording the fact, and we're going to record dish names here. Dish names or dishes? Let's keep it as dish names for now. I think that'll be a little bit less code. And then we can just show refactoring in the future, kind of maybe refactoring these stores under unit tests. I think that'll be valuable. So we create a new restaurant, and then we just do this.restaurants.push new restaurant. Now, if you're used to Redux, and even React in general, using push to mutate a value could be very off-putting. But that's what we're going to do. That's the MobX approach, and it may feel a little different, but like stretch yourself and let's go with it. So wait, I've already just done the wrong thing. I don't need this unit test right now because we're not using those. We'll just delete that out. I've already said the wrong thing here because instead of creating a restaurant array here, we're going to do new restaurant name. So we're going to instantiate a new restaurant instance. Now, even the idea of using classes instead of just simple JavaScript constructs also is kind of different. It's a different approach, so let's just kind of check out the new approach here. Yes, Juddy, it does in fact feel sinful. Might need Juddy or somebody else to pair with me on Redux to help me to understand it better. Okay, so so we create a new file for our restaurant class for an instance of a restaurant. We're going to export a restaurant here. We're going to give it we don't need to do that, but in the constructor, we're going to take a name, and we're going to set this.name equal to name, and then we're going to set, what was the deal? It was dish names, yeah. And actually that we can even set up here. Dish names equals empty array. Cool. So this is going to allow us, so even here, like we've encapsulated a little bit of logic. So restaurant store right here doesn't need to know that a list of dish names needs to be set up to an empty array. So this is kind of an object-oriented approach, is to separate out some of this logic into multiple pieces. I should not even say object-oriented approach because there's ways to separate out logic in functional programming as well. So no problem there. I wonder if Visual Studio Code will autocomplete here. Yeah. If you're not using Visual Studio Code, auto import will happen sometimes. I still haven't got it working on all my projects, but it works pretty well. So yeah, so check it out. So now the restaurant store, we can call add restaurant on it, and it instantiates a new restaurant and pushes it into the array. And then the restaurant constructor sets the name and gives us a list of dish names here. And then I think what we're going to do is on the restaurant, we're going to do add dish. And we're just to keep things parallel, we're going to just say name. And then we're going to say this.dish names, push, we're pushing again, pushing the name on there. Okay, cool. So now we can change restaurant list, how it stores the restaurants and how it makes changes to it. So I think to make sure we have things in a centralized place, let's go up and create the store up at the top level here. Let's say restaurant store equals new restaurant store. And we get it imported, very beautiful. Now is the time, so we've got a restaurant store here. It's instantiated in the app, but it's not available in in the rest of our components. So how do we get it there? So in this case, we're gonna do, use some MobX magic. I'll put it back, am I gonna put it back over? No, I'll just demo for you. So what we're gonna do we wanna do that first? Yeah, let's do it. Okay, let's start from there. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna do, no, I have no idea. We're going to check the docs to see what the first things we're going to do. Inject. Dang it. MobX, you're not helping me out here. Okay, everyone gets to watch me. Yeah, okay, it looks like I'm going to have to look on my computed branch instead. That's fine. Sorry for the pause. Yeah, there we go. All right, provider, that's what it's called. Nope, also not in the MobX docs. That's interesting. Oh, is it because of MobX React? Yeah, it's MobX React. So, I didn't say this before. So, in advance, I added MobX and MobX React to my production dependencies here. So, MobX is the kind of framework agnostic store, and just like with Redux, MobX React maps it and connects it to React. So, how does that work? So, the first thing we're going to do is, yeah, here it is. So, at the root of our app, we're going to surround it with a component to kind of hook things up as you're used to doing elsewhere in React. Provider, nope, that doesn't find the import there. So, what we're going to do is we're going to import provider from MobX React. So, there's a provider component here. What this allows us to do is to say provider restaurant store equals restaurant store. So this is basically making restaurant store object available for any other component underneath that wants to pull it in. And that's just kind of the MobX way to do that. So now that component, that class should be available. But remember, it's still just a plain class right now. So we haven't actually gotten reactivity or anything working. So now in our restaurant list, what can we do? Well, I will check my cheat sheet to find out. So in our restaurant list, we want to add an annotation, a decorator. And if you haven't used decorators before, it's an interesting kind of new, still not quite finalized, but a new ECMAScript feature that allows you to kind of add this metadata to classes that allows you to hook in and decorate them to add additional functionality. Okay, so we're going to say inject, oh, and the import doesn't work there, restaurant store. Inject. So that autocomplete is not correct. And so we're going to do import inject from MobX React. Let's put it up there. So what this is going to do is this is going to make the restaurant store that we shared available on this component. So, but what else is going to happen? Like, this is just a class, and when we update it, what's going to cause reactivity to happen? How is that going to work? Well, let's go back into the class to show you. So a core part of MobX is what's called an observable. Let me make sure I hook this up right. Checking. Yeah, okay. So when we have a property of an object that we want to dynamically update the user interface when necessary, what we can do is import something else called observable. And this is a decorator that we apply to a property that kind of wraps it. And this says, hey, whenever I modify this now by pushing to it, when I mutate it, let the rest of the application know. So MobX has a system that tracks that this changes. And so then what happens? So then what we do is over in a React component, we do observer. This is observer in contrast to observable. And we also annotate our class with observer. And so what this says is, this is React specific, and what this says is, was this React specific? No. So observable is not React specific. This is just a generic class, generic observable. But specific to React, you can wrap a component with observer, and this lets MobX know, hey, I may be using, or I will be using MobX reactive stuff within the render function. So now what's going to happen is if a MobX object is accessed during the render function, MobX is going to track it, and then if it changes in the future, it's going to re-render. So I think that may be the only reactive annotation that we need, because it's going to kind of flow down from here to the restaurants we add and to the names that we add under there and kind of hook it all up to reactivity. But what we do need to do is to start working with a restaurant store in the restaurant list. Michelle Westrate, the creator of MobX, has much better explanations for all those things on his end, so I can link to some of those resources as well if you want to check out those. But let's see how things kind of hook up. So what we want here to change now, and I'm going to look at my cheat sheet to make sure I get it right. We're going to be able to simplify our class here a lot, just like if you were any other a time when you're moving your state out into a centralized place outside of your components. So we're no longer tracking restaurants inside the restaurant list. We no longer need to instantiate a restaurant here. Instead, we can remove restaurants from here. And again, this should feel kind of familiar. Just like in the dish list, we removed the state management out of it. Now we're removing the state management out of restaurant list. So what we're going to do is this.props. This.props, right? Yeah. In fact, let's do it this way. Const restaurant store. The props. So props is the way inject provides data to the component. So it's kind of like creates a higher order component where these props are added. You might be familiar with that. So we're going to call restaurant store.add restaurant. Is that what I called it? Yeah. New restaurant name. So that now calls this method into the store that's going to mutate the store. We'll kind of go back in and simplify this state here where we set is add modal visible. We can even put that on one line. That's fine. Well, let's keep it on 2 lines because that other one is. So that's nice. Okay. So yeah, we mutate the restaurant store. All right. We're no longer going to need to pass on an add dish because that way of updating things did not work out for us. So we'll just kind of remove that, and we'll go back in and update the restaurant store. The dish list screen in a moment. Sorry for how many changes are involved in here. Like, there is a good amount of changes when you redo your state management layer. But one of the nice things about end-to-end tests is we're going to be able to rerun the end-to-end test to confirm that everything is still working when we're done. All right, so now restaurants is not coming out of state. Instead, yeah, this props restaurant store. So again, we're just accessing this array out of the restaurant store. We can even destructure it like we're used to doing. Oh, handle add dish. What are we doing there? Oh yeah, handle add dish goes away actually, because that is no longer needs to be passed in. Yeah, what we want to do is here, we want to get is add modal visible from here, but get restaurants from this props restaurant store. So now we have our restaurants here. And so here, almost 99% of the time, MobX, the magic it adds through observers and observables is invisible to you, and you don't need to worry about it. Here is one case where things get a bit weird. And I'll share it to you. I'll show it to you in the docs so you know to look into it. So check this out here. Array limitations in MobX 4 and below. Now we're on MobX 5. It says, due to limitations of native arrays in ES5, observable array will create a faux array object instead of a real array. In practice, they work just as fine as native arrays, but if you call array.isArray on them, it'll say false. So basically, if somebody's third-party code is going to check it to see if it's an array, it could cause a problem. So they recommend calling array.slice whenever you pass MobX observable arrays into third-party code. So again, from the way this is written here, it shouldn't be needed for MobX 5, but I found in playing around that it is actually needed in my case. Maybe I'm doing something wrong, but for now, I'll call slice, and it's just something good to keep in your mind. It's kind of like the one caveat that I've run into in MobX is if something's not working, think about if you need to call slice on an array, and then things are fine. All right, so I think this restaurant list is now fully updated. Yeah, that might be needed a little bit later. That's fine. Okay, so now let's go into dish list because things are going to be a bit different. So why don't we need handle add dish anymore? Let's see here. Thank you for bearing with me as I kind of step through this code here. Yeah, so check this out. Handle add dish. So we no longer have an on add dish action that's been passed in. So what do? Well, do we need to get the restaurant store? Well, that's what I thought at first because I was so used to that in the React world and in a lot of the front-end world, but it turns out that we actually don't need to. So we can get the restaurant. We already, somewhere in here we're getting the restaurant. Are we not? I think we're going to need that down here anyways. I'm losing track here. Yeah, here we go. We've gotten the dish names out of the passed-in restaurant here. Let's just get the restaurant here. So we get the passed-in restaurant, and then we just say call restaurant add dish. Let me make sure that that's the right method. Add dish with a name. And that's it. We're good to go. Now that's got to feel dirty. If the mutation earlier feels dirty, we're taking a parameter that was passed in and we're mutating it. It's crazy. This is not the normal React mindset, and it doesn't work if you're just using plain objects being passed around or plain classes. But MobX allows this to work and wires it all up for us. And there's lots of pros and cons between having your state and your management centralized versus decentralizing it as MobX does. But one of the pluses here is that we don't need to pass a bunch of functions around. The restaurant itself has logic to it. It has intelligence to it, and things are all wired up. Again, I've probably not wired up everything totally correctly here from the start, but ideally when you get it working, everything's wired up just fine. Now we do need to make dish list an observer as well, so let's just kind of copy that in. Observer. But we don't need to inject anything. We don't need to inject the restaurant store because we just have the restaurant pass in as a property. But we do need an observer to let MobX know, or to let React know that when the render method is called, if something that is dependent on changes, to rerun the render. So our hope here is that while we're on the dish list screen, when we add the dish here, it would update on the screen right away, as well as store it so that when we go back to the restaurant list and navigate back to the dish list, that the dish would still be there as well. So I'm going to take a very, very brief glance over the code here to see if there's any changes that I've missed. We may need some, I think I found we may need some test changes due to something about the way things refresh. So we'll see. That's incidental and not related to the changes here. Yeah, I think we're good. So let's try to rerun it. And again, you'd need to kind of rebuild detox if you added in MobX, but because I've already added in earlier, we're good. So let's rerun the test here and see what happens. Again, we've made major changes, but our end-to-end test is going to allow us to make those changes with confidence. It's going to let us know if something blows up. Okay, Sushi Place adds. Oh, and then something has blown up already. So let's see here. Sushi Place should allow managing restaurants. Let's go back to the test and find out what's going on. We'll close other tabs. Let's start at the start here. One downside to this approach we've taken of this this feature tour where we go through the entire app is that you don't get great feedback on exactly what part is blowing up in. So let's just disable create dish and then we'll run create restaurant to make sure that at least that part works. Sushi Place, we save it and it shows up. That passes. All right. So now we're creating dish. Let's comment out the dishes persisting, and I could have made that a separate function so it was easier to comment out. But so let's just see. Sushi Place, add it in, taps, we add a new dish, volcano roll, but it doesn't show up right away. Okay, so at least at this point, we might have seen some finickiness earlier, but at least at this point, the new dish is not showing up on that list. You know what I think it is? I think it's probably exactly the thing I said a moment ago, slice. Dish names, I did not slice. I'll bet you that's what it is. So yeah, it is a stumbling block. Again, I should get with Michelle Westrate or somebody else in MobX and ask them, push up the sample code and ask them if they can figure out why it is that it's failing, because in MobX 5 it should be working. Cool. All right, so that our pre-existing test is working, so let's now see if dishes persist. We could see that the dish shows up on the screen right away. Let's see if we can now go off the screen and back on. Add in the new dish. It shows up right away. We go back to restaurants and back in and it's there. It's good to go. Our end-to-end test is passing. Sweet. All right, so let's make a, do I make commits here? I don't want to lose these changes. I'll tell you what, to be safe, although we are going to spend the rest of our time together, or the next part of our time together, unit testing to drive out these components. But let's commit what we have now so we don't lose it. And then we'll temporarily remove and re-add the store values. All right, so we're going to add source store. I do the thoughtful pose. Yeah, the beard, I do frequently stroke that as well. All right, so we've added in our store. And so I'm going to... Let's review the changes we're making elsewhere here. And again, this is a very helpful process. We're just confirming that we changed exactly what we expect. So in the root of our application, we're using provider, we're instantiating a restaurant store, and then we're using the provider component to make it available to our app. Then in our dish list, so again, we're thinking 2 levels down to the dish list, we're hooking it up to MobX React so it'll react to changes. And so now we're no longer storing dish names in the state. That makes sense because we don't want them to be stored there. All right, so so in the render method now, okay, we're changing dish names to not. Oh, we got a bunch of things happening. Let me split it up here to see. Okay, in handle add dish, we're no longer setting dish names on the state. We are getting the restaurant param, calling restaurant.add dish, and then setting the state. And we're no longer setting the dish names there. So that code change makes sense. This is helpful for you to kind of think through the changes we've made. Now, instead of retrieving dish names from the state, we're retrieving them from the restaurant param here and making them available. All right. Okay, and then we pass in slice to make sure that arrays are accessible to React and they know things the way they're supposed to be done. Now we're back up at the restaurant list, the higher level. So this time we need observer and inject because we want it to react to changes in the MobX data as well as injecting the restaurant store to make it available. Incidentally, it could be, if I knew that this was always going to be the root of my app, it could be that maybe I could instantiate restaurant store right in this class and make it available right in this module. But I have a little uncertainty about that. I feel like maybe I'll rearrange things in the navigation so that we can come off. Really what I'm worried about is sometime at a point in the future, I'm going to make it so I can navigate off the restaurant list screen, and then that restaurant store would go away. So by instantiating it back up at the app level, I ensure that that restaurant store will always be available. So it's just a little bit extra safety there. Okay, we removed the restaurant array from the component state. And then, okay, here's a couple different changes. Let's process this. Okay, instead of constructing a new restaurant object ourselves and then storing it onto the restaurant array, instead we're getting the restaurant store from props because it was injected. We're calling the add restaurant method and letting the restaurant store handle and encapsulate, that's an object-oriented term for you, encapsulate the logic of what it means to add a new restaurant. And then in the local component state, we're only storing is add modal visible. So that all makes sense. Then down in the render method, we are pulling restaurants off of the restaurant store prop that was passed in, and we're only getting is add modal visible from the state. And we're slicing restaurant array again to make sure that React Native can see, and really it's actually to make sure that React Native sees it as a normal array, and to make sure that MobX sees that we're accessing it there. All right, that looks good. So let's commit it. Store to MobX. Switch storage to MobX. So now we've got 20 minutes left. So what do I mean when I say that we've spiked this code and we want to go back and unit test it? Well, again, just to recap what I was saying at first. So these classes are super trivial. I mean, look how I have to zoom in for you to see it. Oh, okay, that was a terrible idea. I'm sorry. But I mean, look how small the code is. It's like super small. And you know, honestly, that's one of the things I love about MobX. If you feel like Redux has a lot of boilerplate and you're writing a lot of code just to get value that you don't need, you know, maybe in certain applications having those separation of concerns is really valuable. But for me and the kind of hobby apps that I create and the way I think about code, I like having very simple code like this. There's a lot of value for me there. So again, like test driving this out, I mean, I'm pushing on an array and pushing on another array. I did not feel a lot of uncertainty about designing these classes. I wanted to use the end-to-end test. I felt uncertainty about, am I going to get observable hooked up right? And especially, am I going to remember to slice the arrays? I mean, that was not an act. I did, in fact, forget to slice that array where I was supposed to. So the end-to-end test has now served its purpose of making sure that everything's hooked up. But now I do want extra protection. Again, maybe you wouldn't for a trivial class like this in a real production application, but I want to demo how we can go back through and test drive these classes after the fact. So what we can do, we could copy and paste the code over. We could comment that out or whatever we want. But I'm just going to comment it out like this. And now we're going to test drive it out. In fact, let's just comment everything out. So now we've got an empty class here. So now we're going to go back into our unit tests. I'm going to make another folder for store. And I'm going to make a test for restaurant store spec.js. All right, so yeah, our tests don't need to just be about components. They can be about MobX objects as well. And without the Redux separation of concerns, it's very obvious what you would test in MobX. Well, you just have different classes that you're going to test. Okay, so we're going to describe restaurant store. And we're going to say, what functionality do we want to confirm here? Describe add restaurant. And what does it do? It increases the length of, let's just say it adds a new restaurant instance to the array. And in fact, this reminds me, I actually want to stop here and come back because I want to test drive out the restaurant first because restaurant store uses it. So let's get just started. Yarn test watch. Let's see if it marks this as pending. I think it will. That's the intent. That's the hope. Failed. Missing second argument. Well, okay. All right. Well, let's just delete restaurant store then. We'll just rename it to restaurant and we'll test drive that out first. Restaurant. Okay, so stop it. Okay, so what do we want to do in a restaurant? Let's actually just throw the restaurant down here. That'll be helpful to us. So this is a core class to our application, so we want to cover its functionality. So let's describe the constructor. It initializes the name property. So we want the constructor to initialize the name property. So let's say this should be a pretty easy test. Const restaurant equals new And let's actually create a name. Sushi place, my favorite place. Create a new restaurant with that name. We're going to say expect restaurant name to equal name. All right. So what does our test say? Actually, is this Mocha Jest, or do we switch to Mocha? I think it is Jest. That's okay. All right, cool. All tests passed. Well, that's surprising. Looks like maybe our Let's see here. Jest test spec store. Let's quit it. I think the rename of the file confused Jest. There we go. We get restaurant spec here. Restaurant is not defined. All right, so now let's import it. And the linter could have found that for us and did. I'm going to do relative paths here. I'm sure there'd be a way for me to set up absolute paths, but for now this is fine. All right, import restaurant. We're on the test. What happens? Restaurant2.default is not a constructor. This is some kind of remapping of stuff, but we can see we're calling the restaurant constructor, and it's not available in here. So, in fact, let's just have a class. I wonder if we just have an empty class, if a constructor will still exist or not. So let's find out. It is great with the just how quickly these tests, especially. I mean, we don't even have to render any DOM or any fake DOM. We're just rerunning super fast. Not DOM, but React Native elements. Okay, cool. Yeah. So a class has a constructor by default, of course, because we call new restaurant, and we just see that the name is not initialized when we don't have a constructor passed up. So we'll create a constructor. Take in name, set this.name equal to name, and we should be set. This test should be passing. Yes, so that's good. Cool. All right. And again, so to step back for just a second here, well, why aren't we adding our test afterwards? Well, you could add the test afterwards, like test after is an option that you can do. But here it's like, this is like test drive after. It's like we wrote the class and now we unwrote it and we're going to rewrite it under test. This can be great for extracting classes as well. You can test drive them as you extract them to make sure you're getting everything covered. Because again, test-driven development gives you confidence that everything is fully covered by test. All right, so what else do we want? We can actually even just consult our commit here to see the other features of restaurant we need to build. We need to add dish. So now we can describe, we could even specify something else. We could say the constructor, it sets up an empty dish names list. Let's, this will be fine. We'll just pass it, initialize it with nothing, that's fine. Restaurant dish names. I don't think equal. I think it may check for array equality here, so this may not work. I mean, it's gonna fail regardless at first. Yeah, so we expected dish names for a new restaurant to be the empty array, instead it was undefined. So let's add that functionality in. Really, we just need to use a class property here to set dish names by default. And it passes. Okay, cool. So yeah, it looks like Jest is actually doing deep equal here, which is really nice. All right, cool. So now we need to do add dish. All right, so now under restaurant, we're going to describe add dish. It adds a new dish name to the dish names array. Okay, so we want a new restaurant. Restaurant add dish. And let's call dish equals volcano roll. Adding dish, and then we're going to say expect restaurant dish names to equal dish. Okay, let's see if that works. All right, restaurant add dish is not a function, so we can add it. Let's do, again, with this approach to test-driven development at the unit level, we just write enough code to fix the current error. That keeps us from going beyond ourselves and ensures that our code is under test, that every detail of our code is more or less under test. All right, now we have an add dish function, but after we add it, add dish names is still an empty array. So let's implement it now. Name this.dish names.push name. We rerun. And we're fine. We're good to go. All right, so with that, we've now test-driven our restaurant class. So that's really great. Again, it looks like when I create, well, when we renamed a class file, it looks like Just Watcher didn't pick it up. But maybe when we create a new one, it'll pick it up. We'll see. Restaurant store.spec.js. I don't see it being picked up. So let's get a failing test in there, and then we'll give Just a chance. And if we get a failing test and it's not picked up, we'll just restart it. I'm gonna copy and paste some of the boilerplate here. We'll leave the import. Yes, we understand we're gonna need to import the class. That's fine. Restaurant store. So what should the constructor do for the restaurant store? Well, it should set up an empty restaurants list. We create a new store restaurants to equal empty array. All right, so it did not run it, so let's quit and restart. All right, restaurant store to default is not a constructor. Again, not the most clear error message. That's okay. JavaScript is complicated. But we've seen now that we just need to add the class. Burn says hi. Burn, good to see you again. Glad you're here. All right, cool. So now that error is passed, and now what we have is we're expecting the initial restaurant array to be an empty array, but instead it's undefined. So that's easy to add. Let's just add an empty restaurants array, and we'll come back to observable in a minute. I'm curious to see what you'll think about the approach I take to test driving, adding that back in. Okay, so this setting up an empty restaurant list is now passing, and that's all that we need for the initial creation of the restaurant store. So now let's describe add a restaurant. It adds a new restaurant instance to the restaurant list. Now, one thing you may be wondering about, so even when I only have one it within a describe block, so one test per group, I'll still create an it. And so why do I do that? On my client project, I've seen developers that if there's only one thing to do, you just say it constructor, because it means a single test and describe means a group of tests. And yes, nothing's going to blow up if you just do it constructor and put the test underneath there. But the goal of this style describe and it style test nesting is to provide a nice hierarchy of things. And to describe what is it that it does. So we're describing something, a class or a function, and then we're saying what it does. So there's a reason it's called it instead of just test. It's meant to lead you into an approach where you're describing aspects of what you're testing. And it's really great because you don't have to think about, well, what should I do in general with theory? You're just thinking conceptually, like, what do I need? Like, what is the next behavior that I need? Caspa DFG says, I love red-green refactor. Yes, thank you for saying that. I actually realized that I may not always be refactoring as much as I need to. I'm doing Juddy's beard stroke and lean over again. So I'll have to remember that. Maybe thinking up for future weeks, I'm going to think about some other cases where we might need refactoring. And of course, in a sense, we are refactoring our code under test here to be able to support MobX. All right, so we add a new restaurant instance to the restaurant list. So we'll create a new restaurant store. I have seen approaches where folks might say, let me make sure that down in this test that the array is empty, and then before we add on the other one. But we already have one test here that asserts that it's empty. I like to just have expectations at the end of my individual tests, but if you're in a case where it's helpful to add them in advance, sure, go for it, try it. I'm just kind of showing the approach that I generally tend to take. All right, so we're gonna do store.addRestaurant, and then we pass in the name. Again, I'll probably say name equals sushi place. Add restaurant with the name. And then, so now what should we say here? Let's say expect store restaurant's length to equal 1. And why am I doing that? Well, it's because I'm going to pull the restaurant out. And it's not that easy to just compare. It's not the same as an object literal. So we just can't say restaurants is equal to an object literal there. Maybe Jess would do it. I don't know, but I'd rather do it this way. Get restaurant store restaurants 0. Now what do I want to do? Expect restaurants name to equal name. So again, this is restaurant name. So again, this is asserting, and I'm not asserting that the restaurant is of class restaurant. That's okay. Like, that's not what the external user of this class cares about. What it cares is that it has a restaurant field, that it has a name field, and then it's equal there. And I don't feel the need to check that this is a restaurant that has a dish names list in it. That the other test can handle that. So let's try this. We've added a good amount for this test. So running store add restaurant is not a function, so let's add it in. Again, just enough to pass the current error, so we add an add restaurant method or function. We rerun, and then we see expect received to equal expected. And again, that's not the most helpful here, but we look here, expect the length to equal 1. We expected it to be 1, but instead it was 0. All right, so what, we can actually pass that in a certain way here. So let's actually try to do that. Like, what's the minimum necessary to pass these tests? So we'll just say this.restaurants push. We'll just push an empty object onto it. Or it could be anything. Just string foo. How about that? Because right now that error just said the length should be right. Okay, so now we've gotten past that length error. The length of restaurants is in fact 1. And we've retrieved the first restaurant, but now we're trying restaurant.name. And instead of sushi place, it's undefined. So this string does not have a .name property. And so we could, and again, like, I don't know, like we could just pass an object, a minimum object that says name. This will actually probably pass this test. So this passes this test. And so I'm not really sure, what would you do at the unit level to drive out that it needs to be a restaurant in there instead of this? I suppose we could check for the dish names field, and then that would be a reason for us to say, let's add in the restaurant. I don't know that I necessarily would. Maybe I feel fine about implementing this with the restaurant class there, but just for the sake of argument, let's do it. Let's say expect restaurant dish names to equal. So now we're saying we need an object that has a dish names array as well. And it's undefined. So at this point we could say, hey, we could duplicate all the fields in restaurant and any future fields we've added. But instead, it's probably better just to create a new restaurant here and to push it onto the list. And we're going to import restaurant. I always get that wrong. Import restaurant from restaurant, and that test is passing. So now we're good. All right, so here's where things get interesting. So we've recreated the functionality of restaurant and restaurant store with one exception. What about the observable annotation? Our app is not going to work now without this. We need this in there, and we can see that if we run the end-to-end test. So let's just do it. Let's run. Let's put that there. Let's pull this here. It may be that it actually works because of coincidence with the way the data is loaded here. But you definitely should not be just like modifying like plain old ECMAScript 6 classes in a React app. Stuff is not going to work when you pass it around. You don't have the reactivity. Huh. So in this case, it actually did. I ran into this earlier, and I'm kind of surprised. I expect, and I've run into this before, it's just a coincidence around when classes are loaded and things like that. Yeah, I think it, I'm not actually sure. But, so we could, if we wanted to be very strict by test-driven development, we could stick with this. I may actually do some research in the next week to see why this was passing, because it's kind of mysterious if it feels like you can just work with classes. You don't need to use MobX at all. So I'll play with that this next week to see what I can do. But in the meantime, like, let's assume that we need to add this in. What I would do, if I could get the end-to-end test failing, I would just add these annotations in under the end-to-end test coverage. I would not feel the need to have a unit test getting us there because from a unit test level, there's still just objects that work the same way. Adding in that observable doesn't break the unit test, keeps things nice and straightforward. But if your end-to-end test is failing, you can let that drive you to add this MobX annotations to wire things up. You could also do sort of an integration test that access the restaurant store and use some reactivity, some asynchronous callbacks to confirm that things are wired up properly. I may play with that sometime. I don't know that I feel the need to now. Because again, for the sake of the application, we have end-to-end tests here that are going to confirm that everything's wired up properly. So cool, that's about it. Let's review what we did real quick before I head out. So we had a problem with our application. We added a new feature where in managing restaurants, we wanted to make sure that the dishes persisted between screens. We tried an approach where we were using just plain React state for that, and we saw a problem because React navigation, when we called the navigations from one screen to the other, using navigator.navigate, navigation.navigate, that is not regular React props passing. So when we changed the restaurant up here, that did not automatically pass down. We decided to go with MobX to wire the screens together, and so we did that, and we built it out and got the functionality working by using the end-to-end test to refactor our application storage into MobX store, restaurant store, and restaurant. We built them out under end-to-end test first because the uncertainty that I had was around the MobX wiring, but then afterwards we came back and added in these tests here. Let me just do a commit here before we head out. What is that going on with restaurant store? Oh, I see that it's just the quotes we used have just changed. So we'll just change that. Add unit tests for store. Cool, so now we've committed our unit test for the store. So we went back in afterwards and redid the implementation of these components. After our spike where we figured out what we needed, we re-TDD'd them to make sure that our code was fully covered by tests. So that's it for today. We've had a good hour, so I think that's great. We'll catch you next week. I think what I'm going to do next week, I'll think it over. I may just kind of go through kind of building out more features of the app, but I think we may start to do something new and interesting. We may get into, you know, we're not persisting our state throughout the application, but it does not persist between runs. So I think what I'd like to do is to store this data to a backend REST database, and we can play with mocking out the backend using Detox so that we don't need to have the backend application running to do our tests. I see one quick test before we go. Jody says, great session. Thanks, Jody. I appreciate you joining in as well. Burin, Kaspa, Remetian as well. Thanks, y'all, for joining and for the questions. I'll have more to share on Twitter, so follow me on Twitter this next week. Ping me on Reactiflux or on Twitch chat, and we'll see you next time as we dive into more making this state permanent and get to know MobX a little bit more. Thanks so much. Catch you next time, and let's go on over to the slide. See ya.